man just emerged from the detention center. He was frantically running down the street. His name was Chris. After being unemployed for a long time, he put in so much effort to get an interview, but he owed so many fines that he got detained overnight. As he ran, he straightened his pants, but his ragged shirt and paint-stained face still made him look disheveled. Chris arrived at the office. The interviewer looked puzzled. Chris assured the interviewer that he could guarantee that when faced with unknown territory, he would do everything possible to learn and find solutions. But the interviewer was still unhappy with his attire and asked, "What would you think if someone came to an interview without a shirt?" Chris pondered for a moment and replied, "Then that person's pants must be really fancy." The interviewers were amused by his witty response and laughed. Chris got the internship. That evening, he returned home. His wife was leaving him for New York. With Chris' unemployment, the family's financial burden had become unbearable. His wife had lost all hope in him. Chris didn't stop her. He just remained silent, faced with the double burden of family and career. He didn't know how to cope. His heart had no answers. Chris' internship began. He also had to take care of his child alone, so his time was limited. To save time, Chris often crossed the street hurriedly, not noticing the approaching car and getting hit. He got up, realizing one of his shoes was missing. With no time to look for it, he had to go to work with one shoe missing. His colleagues mocked him. He put in a lot of effort and made an appointment with a client, but a colleague asked him to park the car instead. Chris had to race against time. After parking, he ran back on the road, but he still arrived late. When Chris got home, he found that because he hadn't paid the rent for so long, the landlord had thrown out their belongings. He had to leave with his son, but they had nowhere to go. Chris took his son to a subway bathroom, where they would spend the night. His son slept soundly in his arms. Chris' eyes were teary, but he didn't dare cry out loud, afraid of waking him up. Hugging his son, he felt only helplessness and guilt. The next day, he took his son to the shelter. Here, the rich drove fancy cars and laughed, while the poor queued up for a bed. Chris finally found a bed for his son. After that, Chris would queue up at the shelter after work every day. If there was no space, he and his son would find a place to sleep, maybe in a public bathroom or on the subway. Time passed quickly, and Chris' internship came to an end. If he passed, he would become a full-time employee tomorrow. He would never have to wander around with his son again. In the office, the boss smiled and asked him, "Are you willing to officially become the company's broker?" Chris nodded, his gaze firm and tears in his eyes. He never told anyone what he'd been through or what he'd sacrificed. Walking on the street, Chris strode confidently through the crowd. He no longer had to run to save time like before. At this moment, he had found his own happiness. Years later, Chris founded his own investment brokerage firm. He walked with his son along the bay. They might miss those tough times, because they always believed that as long as they held on to their dreams, happiness would eventually knock on their door.